Okay, profiles of Scripture supporting cast. We've only got a few weeks left. We're like 2/3 of the way through this quarter. We have, this is the last Sunday in August, so we have September, and haven't even got to the Old Testament yet. I was expecting, actually, when I began this study, or at least began thinking about it, I thought, well, we'll spend about 6 weeks studying the New Testament characters, and then 6 weeks studying the Old Testament characters. Well, it's not working out that way, is it? But New Testament has a lot of characters in it, a lot of, I think we've laid some pretty good groundwork for some more in-depth studies maybe later on. And so we'll probably get at least 3 weeks of Old Testament characters. I don't know that we'll actually begin next week because as I was thinking about the last group of New Testament characters I wanted to cover, I was thinking about this particular group and thinking, well, we really need to touch on these before we move to the Old Testament, and we're going to. That's what we're going to study today, this last group of characters from the New Testament. And as I was thinking about those characters, I knew from the start that these are going to be different because we're not going to learn as much from the characters themselves as we are from the historical setting that these characters are in. There's some really important lessons that we can learn from the context itself. So that's going to make it a little bit different from the other characters we studied in the New Testament. But also, as I began studying these characters, I began going down a path I really wasn't expecting. And I arrived somewhere I really wasn't expecting to be there. But I found myself so far down the path, I couldn't turn back. So I just kept going. And so that's why we may not finish this lesson today. It may be next week before we finish it, but there's some really important lessons that we can glean from these characters. So having said all that, I'm going to show you the characters now. Can you see them? Okay. More busts. You know, these sculptures from the ancient past. Anybody recognize any of the faces? Any guesses? What? Any guesses? Okay, I heard a couple of right answers. These are the 12 Caesars. They're called the 12 Caesars for a reason. There's a Roman historian named Suetonius. He was actually the personal secretary of Emperor Hadrian, who was one of the emperors of the Roman Empire, early 2nd century. So Suetonius had access to a lot of information about these first Caesars in the Roman Empire. And so he wrote these biographies, series of 12 biographies on these 12 Caesars, he called them. And so I thought this would be a good place to start. The reason that these 12 Caesars are so important to us for our study is all these men were the most powerful men in the world during the first century. The first century, right? That's what we're studying. The first century, the life of Christ, the early church, all happened in the first century. So these were the men in power at that time. And like I said, these were some strange characters. I'm going to tell you. The more you study the Caesars, the more you understand it. Depraved madness. I mean, it's just unbelievable some of the stunts these guys pulled. But like I said, it's not so much the characters themselves as it is the historical context that I wanted to look at and use these guys as a backdrop, kind of. Because their places in history are the backdrop for some really important historical information about the first century. And one of the really important things about studying the Caesars is the dates of their reigns. And the reason the dates of their reigns is so important to us as Bible students is because these dates become chronological anchor posts. Chronological anchor posts. We can tie some New Testament events to these dates. And so what that means to us is these New Testament events that we read about and in the gospel accounts and Acts and even in some of the epistles in the New Testament, these events then are firmly fixed in historical context. historical context. So you see the importance of this. And that's why I wanted to look at some of these men. Now, 5 of these men in particular are important to us because they actually reigned during the first 60 years of the New Testament era. And we know the New Testament basically covers the first century. But most of the New Testament narrative itself really just focuses on the first 60 years or so of the first century. You have the life of Christ, and then you have the early church, and then you have about 30 years. New Testament record, Acts in particular, covers about 30 years, the first 30 years of the church. So we're looking at the first 60 years of the New Testament in our New Testament narrative, and that's when 5 of these men were actually ruling during that time. The rest of them reigned throughout the remainder of the first century. And we won't give as much attention to them, but I do want to focus a little bit more on these 5 in particular who were reigning during the days of the New Testament. So we're just going to quickly first go over all of these so I can put a name with the faces for each of you and just give you a little bit of background information, just to kind of lay the groundwork for what we're going to do the remainder of this class and probably into the next week as well. Okay, so the first one is Julius Caesar. Everybody knows Julius Caesar, right? Julius Caesar actually wasn't an emperor, but he was more of a military dictator, and he used the army to kind of consolidate his power, and he named himself dictator for life. Well, what he ended up doing was he ended up actually destroying the Roman Republic, which up to that time they'd had a kind of a democratic Republican form of government, similar to what we have actually, with 2 houses of the Senate. But he ended that, and he also ended his own life because he became a threat, and so there was a conspiracy. He was assassinated, and so the conspirators what they were trying to do was they were trying to save the Republic, but what they ended up doing was, of course, when they assassinated Caesar, they ended up ushering in the Roman Empire, because 2 years later, after his death, he was declared a god by the Roman Senate, and the name Caesar became a title. Caesar was his last name. Well, from that point on, Caesar became a title for the emperors who would serve during the Roman Empire. So I mentioned Julius Caesar because he was really the one who put it into motion. He put the Roman Empire into motion. He did away with the Roman Republic, and the Roman Empire became the empire of the day after Julius Caesar. So he had an adopted nephew named Octavian, who became the first emperor. We don't call him Octavian, we call him Augustus, because the Senate gave him this name, Augustus. And you know what Augustus means? Augustus means the exalted one, because you see, they had already declared his uncle Julius Caesar a god, and so these people were considered gods by the Roman powers, and so Caesar Augustus became his name, the first of the Caesars, the first of the emperors of the Roman Empire. We'll come back to him because the New Testament actually mentions him by name. The next Caesar was Tiberius Caesar. He reigned. He was the stepson of Augustus, and there's several references to him in the New Testament as well. We'll come back to Tiberius. Caligula was actually his nickname. He was a real character, nephew of Tiberius. We'll come back to him because he was the third reigning emperor. And then Claudius, uncle of Caligula. He's also named in the New Testament, so we'll come back to him. And then Nero. Now, I think I heard somebody mention Nero. Maybe they recognized him before I even put the name up there. I don't know. But Nero, of course, was one of the really notorious Caesars, responsible for the first Roman persecution of Christians. And we'll definitely be coming back to him in just a moment. But following Nero's death, by suicide actually, the empire fell into civil war in a period that was called the Year of the Four Caesars. And you can imagine why it's called the Year of the Four Caesars. A 12-month period, there were 4 Caesars, up and down, up and down, up and down. The first one was Galba. He was actually appointed by the Senate after Nero's death, but then he fell victim to a coup and was executed. And so Otho followed him. He came into conflict with the troops that were supporting his rival, Vitellius, and so he ended up committing suicide. Vitellius was the third emperor to serve. He was again recognized as emperor by the Senate, but during the time that he was put on the throne, there was a general called Vespasian. Vespasian was a famous Roman general. At the time, he was in Judea, laying siege to the city of Jerusalem, putting down the Jewish revolt, because by this time, late 60s, the Jewish wars had begun. They were revolting, trying to throw off Roman dominion. Vespasian went over there to squelch that. Well, he had a very loyal army behind him, and Vespasian's army, after they put down the Jewish rebellion, they declared him Roman emperor, marched back to Rome, killed Vitellius, and so Vespasian became the next Roman emperor. He wasn't related to any of the former Caesars, so he established a new dynasty known as the Flavian dynasty. His two sons would reign after him. His first son, Titus. Titus has some, he's known for one thing in particular. Anybody know what that is? Before he became emperor, he had taken his father's place as commander of the Roman army. He, like his father, had been in Judea, again laying siege to Jerusalem, because the Jews just wouldn't be quiet. You know, they were a very revolting type people, and the Romans, had it with them. And so Titus, after Vespasian, his father, became emperor, Titus was there leading the army. And what did Titus do? Anybody know? Yeah, he's the one who laid siege to Jerusalem, tore down the walls, destroyed the temple. Fulfillment of prophecy, right? I mean, it hadn't been long before, just 30 or 35 years before, when Jesus predicted that very thing. Remember talking to the disciples? They saw this huge temple with the huge stones, and he says, one's not going to be laid on top of the other. And that's exactly what happened. The time was 70 AD. Titus, after he destroyed Jerusalem, put down the Jewish revolt, basically ended the Jewish economy. Israel of the Old Testament was no more after 70 AD. There were still Jews all over the world, but they weren't the Israel of the Old Testament. That was the end as far as God was concerned. His patience had basically run out. So Titus became emperor, and then he had a brother, another son of Vespasian, who also has some notoriety attached to his name. Domitian, he reigned during the last 15 or so years of the first century, AD 81 through 96. Because the Christians, I mentioned earlier the emperor, the deity, they exalted, Augustus was called the Exalted One. They had declared Julius Caesar a god. All the Caesars following him were considered gods. And so emperor worship, or this imperial cult worship, became a tool used by the Roman government to keep all the subject nations at bay, to keep them submissive. And so Domitian was one of the first to use this. And when Christians who would not participate in the emperor worship began a empire-wide persecution, he would send out notices to all the provincial governors to, if you're Christians, they need to be brought into submission. And so it could be, some people believe that in Revelation chapter 1, verse 9, John used the word tribulation, and some people believe that that word may refer to this persecution, this empire-wide Roman persecution of Christians began at about that point in Domitian's reign. We'll come back to this later in our study. But the Apostle John, of course, was exiled during this time, the last decade of the first century. He was exiled on the island of Patmos during these persecutions of Domitian. Now, Domitian is not mentioned in the New Testament, but we have, of course, references to persecutions and so on. And so I wanted to mention him along with those facts. He was assassinated, actually, in a plot which included his servants, private guards, politicians, court officials. it was a chaotic time in the Roman Empire. I mean, some of these emperors were very powerful men, and some of them exerted a lot of influence for good and for bad, but it was just an awful time, an awful time. And so that's kind of the background, the backdrop for what we want to look at. And as I said, 5 of these in particular, we're going to take a little closer look at them to give us a little bit better feel for what we're going to get into later on. Okay, so the first is Augustus. Octavian by birth, he was the adopted nephew of Julius Caesar. He became the first Caesar. He reigned from 27 BC to 14 AD. And there's a reference to him. He's mentioned by name in Luke chapter 2, verse 1. He's the one who ordered the census for taxation. So there in Luke 2, verse 1, we read, "It came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered." You know what this led to, of course. Joseph and Mary had to go from Nazareth down to Bethlehem because they were both from the family of David, and that was his hometown. So they had to go to Bethlehem to be registered for taxes. And of course, that's where Jesus was born. We have the birth of Jesus during the reign of Caesar Augustus. And it's interesting that, Caesar Augustus, most powerful man in the world, he had probably never even heard of the God of Israel or the promised Messiah, probably didn't know anything about the prophet Micah, who had actually predicted that Christ would be born in Bethlehem. Yet it was his decree that helped fulfill his prophecy. I mean, it's kind of amazing, isn't it, when you have God working in the background, manipulating these powerful characters, and they end up doing exactly what he wants them to do without them even knowing it. And that's exactly what happened with Augustus Caesar. Probably what he's best known for is the Pax Romana. That's a Latin term which means peace of Rome. And actually, his ascending the throne as emperor of Rome began a 200-year period of unparalleled peace in the ancient world. There were still a lot of wars going on, a lot of strife, but the fact is, for 200 years, Rome kept a pretty good handle on conflicts around the world, at least within their power. And so the Pax Romana, almost a 200-year span of relative peace throughout the Roman Empire. Okay, so that's Caesar Augustus, first Roman emperor. Then we have Tiberius Caesar. He was a stepson of Augustus, and there's a reference to him. Again, Luke makes this. He reigned from 14 AD to AD 14 to 37. Okay, John began his work on the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. So, our historian Luke was very detail oriented. And so look at this passage in Luke 3, verses 1 and 2. "Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea in the region of Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, while Annas and Caiaphas were high priests, the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness." So you see, John is tying these events in the early life of Christ, the beginning of John's ministry, to these historical dates, fixing them firmly in history. Also, of course, Jesus' ministry would have occurred during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, since he reigned all the way up to 37 AD. And there's another reference to him. Sometimes you'll see, kind of like with the Herod, sometimes you'll see the name Caesar or Herod mentioned, and it almost seems like a generic form, but it's actually, they're referring to whoever was in power at that time. And so there's a reference to Tiberius Caesar. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all point out this particular incident when, the Jews were, Pharisees were trying to trap Jesus and getting him to say something and get him in trouble with the Roman government. Should we be paying taxes to Caesar, they said. And you recall Jesus' response. He said, "Show me one of the tribute coins." It would have the image of the Caesar on it. Probably, it could have been Augustus, but it may have been Tiberius. but had an image of the Caesar on it. And remember what Jesus told them. He said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So the Caesar they're referring to there would have been, of course, Tiberius Caesar. There's another reference to him when Jesus was before Pilate. And when he was before Pilate, the Jews again were trying to get their way with Pilate. And we looked last week or week before at Pilate, and you know how weak he was when it came to having moral courage and just not willing to do the right thing, even though when he knew the right thing to do was to release Jesus. And so the Jews told Pilate this. This was their this is what they were going to use to really get him. This was their last attempt to get him to do. This was their twisting his arm. This is what they told him. From then on, Pilate sought to release Jesus, but the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend, Caesar Tiberius. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar, you see. Okay, so of course that's all Pilate needed. I got to stay in good standing with Caesar. So he gave in to the Jews. And of course the church had its beginning during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. So again, we have these fixed dates that give us the time when these really important events happened in New Testament history. Okay, Caligula. Caligula reigned for just a short reign, like about 4 years, AD 37 to 41. He followed Tiberius. He's not mentioned in the New Testament, but I wanted to include him because he was in power during that 4-year period. And this would have been the time when the church began, of course, shortly after the church began. And then this would have been during the time when Paul was probably converted. You know, during this age of 37 to 41 AD, shortly after the church began. Paul's conversion. He was actually killed by his own Praetorian Guard. Can you believe it? I mean, this man was bizarre. He was mad. He was depraved. He did some outrageous things. I mean, can you imagine? He was going to appoint his horse as a consul to the Senate. I mean, he was that type of character. And his own Praetorian Guard actually assassinated him, killed his wife and his daughter as well. So Claudius was the next emperor to follow Caligula. Claudius is mentioned a couple of times in the New Testament as well. He reigned from AD 41 to 54. And the first time he's mentioned is in Acts 11, 27 through 28, in the prophecy of Agabus. And in these days, prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch. Then one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. So see, here again, we have these fixed events attached to dates that are corroborated by secular history. Really important. We need to give Luke a lot of credit for this. I mean, he knew what he was doing when he attached these. He gave us these little details about these historical characters and dates and events and so on. Beginning of Paul's missionary journeys. This would begin. Paul's first and second missionary journeys would have been during the time when Claudius was in power. And also there's another mention of Claudius in Acts 18, 1 and 2, when Paul came to Corinth. He had banished the Jews from Rome. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. He found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them. That's Acts 18, 1 and 2. And then we have Nero. Nero reigned from AD 54 to 68. He became emperor during Paul's second missionary journey. And Paul made his appeal to this particular Caesar. Remember when Paul was in Caesarea in prison, the Jews had tried to kill him in Jerusalem. He was taken to Caesarea to stand trial there. And first Felix heard him, and then Festus. Well, when he was before Festus, Festus was trying to get Paul to go back to Jerusalem and stand trial before the Sanhedrin. Well, Paul knew that he would not get a fair deal before the Sanhedrin. And so this is what he told Festus in Acts 25:11. If I'm an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there's nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. And he was appealing to Nero. That was his right as a Roman citizen. And we'll get to that a little bit later too. But Roman citizens had rights that slaves and other subject people, non-Romans, didn't have. And Paul had been born in the Roman province of Tarsus. He was a Roman citizen by birth. He had rights. And he used one of those rights right here. He didn't have to go through an unjust trial before the Jewish people who had already tried to kill him several times and were determined if they had him before trial, he would end up being dead. And so he knew that was going to happen. So he appealed to Caesar. And so it was the Nero that he appealed to. So Paul's first Roman imprisonment was during the reign of Nero. And this is interesting. Some in Nero's household were actually converted to Christianity. We know this because of Paul's closing in his letter to the Philippians, which he wrote toward the end of his first Roman imprisonment. In Philippians 4:22, he wrote, "All the saints greet you, but especially those who are of Caesar's household." So that's an interesting comment there. And again, it goes to show that regardless of a person's situation, their circumstances, the people they're associated with, it doesn't prevent them from obeying the gospel of Christ. Here we see some more examples of that very thing. Some of Nero's, a very notorious emperor who waged persecution against Christians, yet some people in his own household actually were Christians. And so we see Paul's second Roman imprisonment occurred during the reign of Nero. And then the first Roman persecution of the church, we'll talk about persecution later on in this class, but up till this point, up till Nero's reign, all the persecution that Christians had suffered had come from the Jewish population, mainly the Jews who just, considered Christ to be a heretic. And there were sometimes Gentiles involved, but it was usually the Jews who always started things. It wasn't the Roman authorities. If Roman authorities became involved, it was just to keep the peace, basically. It wasn't to persecute Christians. But the Jews had been the ones that were persecuting up to this point. But Nero, tradition says that he set a fire to Rome, burned down more than half of the city. Tradition says he did it so he could have more room to expand his palace. But he ended up blaming the fire on the Christians and used this as a pretext for persecuting them. And so this is when the first widespread, empire-wide persecution of the church began during the reign of Nero. Peter and Paul, according to tradition, were executed during this time as well, during this first persecution of the church, which had been in the mid to late 60 A.D. Eusebius, one of the church fathers, says that they both died during this time. The Jewish wars also began in A.D. 66, and of course they would, as we said earlier, they would end with the destruction of Jerusalem in A.D. 70. So this is an amazing thought, that these most powerful men in the world were unknowingly playing supporting roles in God's redemptive plan. They really were. They had no idea. To them, those who even knew anything of Christ just thought of him as a minor character, somebody who was a troublemaker, really just stirring up trouble over in Judea. But they had no idea they were playing supporting roles in God's redemptive plan. So that kind of sets the stage for this study here. So as I said earlier, when we first began this series of lessons, the main thing I want to do is see what we can learn from these studies, from these characters. And as I said earlier, we can't learn a lot from the Roman emperors as far as their character goes, except how not to live, basically. But as I said, the setting itself, the historical context in which they live, provides a lot of good information for us and can actually build up our faith. And so one of the first lessons I want to look at is that Christianity is a historical religion. As I've said several times already, we see these events are firmly fixed in history during the reigns of these emperors. And so we see Christianity, it's not some myth that was made up, or even oral traditions that are passed down over the years. It's firmly fixed and based on actual events, backed by dates, by real people in history, places that can be checked and verified. This is really strong evidence for the authenticity, the truth of the New Testament narrative. And I think it's a really important lesson for us. Christianity is a historical religion based on facts, things that really happened, not hearsay, not things that have been passed down through the ages. That's a really important lesson for us to remember. Another is Christianity began precisely when God planned, in the days of the Roman Caesars, the fullness of the time. And we're going to look at two passages here. The first is in Daniel chapter 2. I like this image right here. Everybody recognize this image, don't you? Yeah. Yeah, in a dream. Whose dream was it? Not Jerry. Who else? Whose dream was it? Who saw this great image? Who? Nebuchadnezzar. Remember the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar? He had this dream. This is Daniel chapter 2. He had this dream. He saw this great image. He couldn't remember anything about the dream. He killed all the wise men because they couldn't tell him what his dream was if he wouldn't tell them, you know. But Daniel, fortunately, of course, prayed to God, and God gave him the interpretation. And so Daniel explained to the king, he said, this image that you saw, he said, you saw this great image with a head of gold, had the arms and the chest of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, and then legs of iron, and the feet were iron mixed with clay. And as you watched, you saw this stone, uncut by human hands, strike the feet of that image, and the image just crumbled. And every shred of the image was blown away by the wind, and the stone itself became a great mountain and filled the world. That's what you saw, he said. He said, God is telling you what's going to happen in the next 500 or 600 years. These are world empires. The head, Babylonians, you're the head of gold. He said they're going to come another empire after yours. It's a little bit less than yours, not as strong, made of silver. That would be the Medo-Persian Empire. But then after them is going to come the Grecian Empire, the belly and thighs of bronze. But then he said, in the days of the fourth kingdom, the ones that represent these legs of iron, the feet iron mixed with clay, strong as iron. In Daniel 2:44 he said this, in the days of these kings, that's the fourth kingdom from Nebuchadnezzar's time, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces, consume all these kingdoms. It shall stand forever. That's a reference, of course, what was going to happen in the fourth kingdom. Now, this is 500 or 600 years down the line. But when we come to the first century A.D., that's when the world empire was that fourth kingdom. It was Rome. It was the Roman Empire. And so Paul makes a reference to this same time period in Galatians 4, verse 4, when he says this, when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. Well, both of these references are to the time of the Roman Empire, when Jesus would be born. And the fullness of time is an interesting phrase. What does it mean? I mean, the context can tell us in the fullness of time. It was precisely when God determined to bring Christ into the world, to have Christ do his redemptive work, to establish his church, for the church to begin, for the church to grow, for the gospel message to be proclaimed throughout the world. That's what the fullness of time means. It's exactly when God decided all of these things to happen. And so I want to look at just a few things that really intrigue me about this idea of fullness of time and God's planning. Why did God determine to pick this particular time? I mean, look at all the centuries before and after, and when he could have chose. But he chose this particular time for several reasons, and we're going to look at them. I think this really defines what the fullness of time is. Yeah, Jerry? Fulfilled? Yeah, it fulfilled all the promises. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That is a different way to look at it. Kind of brings all the prophecies, up front. Okay. So, but you look at what was happening after the close of the Old Testament. The Jews, after the Syrian captivity, and then which took away the northern kingdom of Israel, and then you have the Babylonian captivity, which took the rest of the Jews out of Palestine into Babylon. That only lasted for 70 years. The Medo-Persians then came and, of course, conquered the Babylonians. And a lot of the Jews returned, but most of them were remaining throughout the known world at the time. They were scattered all over the place after those two captivities, and then the fall of the Medo-Persian Empire, and then the Greek Empire, and then it fell. And then, of course, Rome came into power. During all this time, Jews became more and more scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, keep in mind that even though they were no longer in their homeland for the most part, they were still God's chosen people. And they had these promises, the prophecies that Jerry just referred to. These promises of this coming Messiah were still waiting on them to be fulfilled. And so, but you don't have them contained any longer in that one little strip of land along the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. They're scattered all over now, scattered all over. So that's very significant, and it plays a really important part in God's scheme of things, the fullness of time. So you have Jews scattered, and since they no longer had access to the temple in Jerusalem, they came up with another way to get together. They began building synagogues. Synagogues were, of course, places of worship where Jews would assemble to study the scriptures and to worship. And these became very, very prolific throughout the ancient world. No matter what nation they lived in, they would build synagogues. I think I've heard if there were at least 10 Jewish men in a community, they would build a synagogue. So synagogues were popping up all over the ancient world. These became favorite places for evangelists such as Paul. If Paul came to a city, if it had a synagogue in it, that's where he would go first, because he knew there were people there who believed in God. He knew they would be receptive. At least they would be listening. They may not like what he said a lot of times, but at least he didn't have to begin at ground zero. He could talk to them about the prophecies that they were already familiar with. So synagogues were an important part in the fullness of the time. And then you have the Greek language. With the thing about the Greeks, Alexander the Great, and the Greek influence in the ancient world was they believed that their culture was the best ever. And not only that, but they actually went to great lengths to make sure that their subject people became as Greek as possible. And one of the things that they did was they really increased literacy. And so one of the great influences that the Greeks had was the increase in literacy throughout the ancient world. And so anyone who could read at all during that time could read Greek. And so that played a very important role, I think, in God's thinking about when to bring his plan to fruition. The Greek language, of course, was used to write the New Testament. The Septuagint, a really, really important factor that played into all of this. Septuagint. What was the Septuagint? Anybody know? Huh? Oh, the Greek Old Testament, exactly. About 280 BC in Alexandria, Egypt, supposedly about 70 scholars got together and translated the Hebrew Old Testament scriptures into Greek. And they supposedly did it in about 70 weeks or 70 days. I'm not sure. That's probably just tradition. But at any rate, Septuagint means 70. So that's how it got its name. But the thing is, it's really important that this happened because now not only Greek-speaking Jews had access to the Old Testament scriptures, but Gentiles alike. Now Gentiles could read about the God of Israel, the Old Testament, and this really became important in the early church. That's all they had. Of course, they didn't have the New Testament in the early church. All they had was the Old Testament scriptures, and all the prophecies that Jerry was making reference to, played a really big role in beginning the church because it was a fulfillment of what God had been promising all along. And so the Septuagint was really important. And this is a really, really interesting point right here. If you look at all of the times that Jesus and the apostles quoted from the Old Testament, and there's a lot of them. I mean, almost every page of Matthew has a quote from the Old Testament. Do you know that 6 of every 7 quotes doesn't come from the Hebrew, original Hebrew, which they could have quoted from? They quoted from the Septuagint. And the reason for that was because so many people were more familiar with the Greek. They read Greek, they spoke Greek, so that's why they used the Septuagint. Really important point that came up, event that happened during the fullness of the time. All right, real quickly, I want to look at 3 things, the Roman contributions to the fullness of time. We already mentioned the Pax Romana, Roman peace, during the reign of Caesar Augustus, this 200-year period of peace, prosperity, expansion in the Roman Empire. There were still wars of expansion, a lot of civil strife and revolts, but the fact is the strength of the Roman military was really a strong preemptive force that kept the peace. I mean, Rome was all about keeping the peace. And so the Pax Romana played a big role in the spreading of the gospel. I mean, it's much easier to spread the gospel in a world that's more or less peaceful than it is a world that's filled with ongoing wars. Roman protection. We mentioned Paul's using his liberty, his privilege as a Roman citizen to appeal to Caesar. But the fact is, Rome was the major world power of the day. And one of the things that Rome wanted to do was protect its subjects, and it could do that. Piracy on the Mediterranean was eliminated, which made sea travel a lot safer. And so any nation or individual who violated Roman law would suffer harsh consequences, and they knew it because the Romans were a cruel people, very cruel. Law and order was really number one for them. And as we mentioned earlier, the Roman citizens had rights and privileges that others didn't have. And then there were Roman roads. Roman roads, of course, they were used to maintain the empire, and they were built soon after Rome would conquer a nation. One of the first things they would do is go in and build these roads, which provided a lot of rapid movement for their armies, as well as increasing the commerce, making land travel safer, easier, faster. Again, a big factor in promoting the gospel. So these are just some of the things that happened prior to the beginning of the church. And so we're going to continue this lesson next week and get into what really I think is the most important aspect of the backdrop for this. Thank you very much for your kind attention.